Excitement once echoed through living rooms in the soft chatter of children's voices, the sound of tiny hands clapping along with songs, and the warm promise of a show that seemed to celebrate innocence itself. For millions of families, Romper Room was more than television. It felt like a classroom, a playdate, and a dream all rolled into one. But behind that comforting glow, behind the friendly teachers and the magic mirror, there was a story far more layered than it appeared. Could a preschool program built on fun and laughter also be a carefully engineered business empire? And how did a simple mirror become a national ritual that shaped childhood for decades? The truth is that Romper Room's history is not only about joy but also about power, profit, controversy, and the strange realities of putting live preschoolers on television. The show began in 1953 with Nancy Claster, a woman with no psychology degree, no major media background, and no corporate empire behind her. Only an idea. She believed children understood and responded to each other better than to adults, so instead of using actors, she put real preschoolers on live television. It was revolutionary at the time. Executives doubted children that young could even focus for more than a few minutes, let alone sustain an entire program. Yet Nancy was right. Children watched, engaged, and parents tuned in with them. Families across America found themselves drawn into the charm of a classroom that wasn't really a classroom but felt strangely familiar. This bold experiment quickly proved itself, and within just a few years, Romper Room had expanded into dozens of local stations, each version carrying Nancy's carefully trained touch. While parents saw a show full of play and lessons, behind the scenes, Nancy and her husband Bert were building one of the most tightly controlled business operations in television. Every station that wanted Romper Room had to purchase a broadcast package, follow rigid guidelines, and even pay for merchandise rights. At its height, Romper Room operated in 150 cities, each bound to the same rules, same training, and same style, all under Nancy's supervision. From 1953 to 1983, she personally trained every single host, requiring them to be certified teachers and pass demanding standards that left little room for improvisation. By carefully controlling the product, Nancy turned Romper Room into an empire that reached 25 countries, all marked by the iconic Jack-in-the-Box logo that every child recognized. It was not only a beloved show, it was a goldmine. But Nancy's ambitions weren't just about money. She had strong ideas about how children should learn. Instead of punishment, which was still common in the 1950s, she introduced the "do and don't be" method. Mr. Doobie, a smiling bumblebee, taught kids to be kind and helpful, while Mr. Don't Be illustrated bad behavior. It was simple, playful, and rooted in observation rather than formal psychology, yet it worked. Children remembered Doobie's lessons long after the program ended. In fact, academic institutions began studying the show's impact, and psychologists observed how it shaped children's understanding of behavior. Balloons, toys, and games tied to Doobie reinforced the lessons and made them memorable, proving that learning could come through fun rather than fear. Still, live television with preschoolers was anything but orderly. Children cried, froze in silence, or wandered off set. Some tugged at cameras, some fell asleep mid-show, and some shouted things no host could prepare for. To handle this chaos, children only stayed for 2 months before new ones rotated in. Even then, demand was so high by the late 1950s that families waited years for a spot. Ironically, some critics joked that it was harder to get into Romper Room than college. Yet even as the audience loved the realness of unpredictable kids, the selection process was strict. Each child went through mental health screenings to ensure they could handle the bright lights, the separation from parents, and the pressure of being broadcast to millions. Those too shy, too hyper, or unable to follow directions were rejected, reflecting the strict discipline ideals of the time. The hosts, too, faced immense pressure. They weren't just TV personalities. They were expected to act as teachers, performers, and flawless role models. To qualify, they needed teaching certification, multiple interviews, and personality tests. Candidates had to prove they could manage dozens of unpredictable preschoolers while reciting scripted lines and seamlessly weaving in advertisements. If they couldn't, Nancy sent them home. Even those who passed endured 2 weeks of rigorous training in Baltimore before they were allowed on air. And while every host followed the same training, local differences created confusion. A child moving from New York to Los Angeles might find 2 entirely different Romper Rooms, with different hosts, different routines, and sometimes even different languages. One of the most cherished parts of the show was the magic mirror segment. A host would hold up the mirror, recite a rhyme, and call out children's names submitted by families at home. For a young child, hearing their name was a thrill, like being seen by television itself. But behind that magic was stress. Hosts had to memorize long lists, fearing the disappointment of a child who waited for weeks only to never hear their name. By 1965, over 100 local romper rooms each had their own magic mirror lists, making the ritual both intimate and overwhelming. Yet this segment remains the most iconic memory for millions who grew up with the show. Romper Room's influence went far beyond television. The program partnered with the President's Council on Physical Fitness during the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, integrating exercise into its routines. It even gained recognition from the U.S. Department of Education, legitimizing it as more than entertainment. And with that credibility came a flood of products: lunchboxes, toys, books, and educational kits, all carrying Romper Room branding. By the 1970s, the show was no longer just a program. It was a lifestyle that stretched across classrooms, playgrounds, and dinner tables. Millions of dollars poured in, and Romper Room became one of the earliest examples of children's television blending content with commerce on a massive scale. Yet fame brought scandals. In 1962, Cher Chesson, a popular local host, became pregnant and unknowingly took thalidomide, a drug linked to severe birth defects. When she sought an abortion, illegal in the U.S. at the time, her fight became a national controversy. She lost her hosting role, received death threats, and endured public humiliation, but also brought attention to women's rights and medical safety. Her personal tragedy exposed the darker side of Romper Room, where the lives of its hosts were scrutinized, and their personal struggles became national debates. HBO even dramatized her story decades later, underlining how deeply it scarred the show's reputation. Even Hollywood had its brushes with Romper Room. In 1979, a young Leonardo DiCaprio appeared on the Los Angeles version. His memory of being kicked off for misbehavior, running toward cameras and pulling his mother into the set, became a quirky story he shared as an adult. Producers later denied firing children, saying they simply moved them off camera, but the tale stuck, blurring truth and legend. Whether exaggerated or not, it added to Romper Room's lore and showed how even the future biggest movie stars once stumbled through its studio. Behind the smiles, pressure on both children and adults was relentless. Psychologists sometimes stood just off camera to help manage nervous breakdowns. Hosts developed secret signals to redirect kids, and backup plans were in place for meltdowns. Yet even the best preparation couldn't prevent live disasters, from children refusing to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to preschool crushes spiraling into tantrums when kids refused to sit apart. This was the raw reality of live TV with children, charming on the outside but exhausting inside. The cracks deepened in 1971 when advocacy groups revealed just how much of Romper Room's content was designed to sell Hasbro toys. Lessons, games, and even Doobie's adventures often served as soft advertisements. Parents began questioning whether their children were learning, or just being turned into consumers. At the same time, reports of local hosts disappearing under mysterious circumstances circulated, usually tied to personal scandals that stations quietly buried. By then, the show was less about teaching kindness and more about keeping sponsors happy. By the 1980s, Romper Room tried to adapt. The format was rebranded as Romper Room and Friends, adding puppet characters and scripted stories, replacing much of the live classroom format. But the magic faded. Without real children and spontaneous laughter, the show lost its authenticity. Local versions shut down, franchises crumbled, and audiences turned to fresher, more polished programs like Sesame Street. The final live Romper Room episodes aired in the early 1990s, ending a 41-year experiment that had once defined childhood television. Still, the show's legacy is undeniable. For 4 decades, Romper Room shaped how children learned about kindness, sharing, and social rules. It taught without punishment, brought joy with simple props, and gave countless children the thrill of seeing themselves, or hearing their names, on television. Yet it also revealed the risks of mixing education with commerce, the fragility of children under public scrutiny, and the enormous pressure on women hosts to embody perfection. Romper Room was both groundbreaking and flawed, both nurturing and commercial, both innocent and deeply complicated. For anyone who grew up in its glow, the memory of the magic mirror, the gentle songs, and the buzzing voice of Doobie remains unforgettable. But for those who look closer, Romper Room stands as a reminder of how television can shape childhoods while quietly serving the interests of business. It was a show that made children laugh and learn, but it was also a machine that made millions and stirred debates that stretched from living rooms to government halls. And even now, decades later, the story of Romper Room remains one of the most fascinating chapters in television history. If you enjoyed learning about the hidden history behind Romper Room, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of the shows and stars that shaped our lives. There's so much more to uncover, and your support keeps these stories alive.